Okay, we're going to talk about instantiation. This lesson will show you how to create something like gun firing or things where you need to create an object on the fly. Here I have my test scene with my robot character and a platform that they can stand on, and we will walk through all of the pieces that are necessary to create a way for this robot to fire a laser shot or something like that. So when you instantiate objects in script, we need to have them available as prefabs. So what I'm going to do is come over here to my prefab folder, and I'm going to create an empty prefab, and this will hold my, and I'll call it laser. This will contain my laser blast shot. Okay, so now I need to build the laser prefab, and the way I do that is I take a game object from the scene. So here I'm going to make my laser blast by dragging this sprite into the scene here, and I'll call this laser blast or something like that, and decide what component does that laser blast object need to have. It's going to need to have a Rigidbody 2D in this case, because I'm going to use force to make this thing move. And I don't want gravity to pull it downward. I just want the laser blast to fire straight to the right. So we're going to set the gravity scale to be 0. If you wanted this object to react to gravity, keep it at 1. So that means, like, for example, a cannonball or something that you want to see arc through the air. And pretty much I just need the Rigidbody 2D here. I probably should have a collider on this as well, so if I want to make it run into things later. So for example, you could add a box collider or something to it. And so once I have the object built the way I think I'm going to use it, come back to my prefabs, and I grab my laser blast and I drag it and I drop it onto my prefab object, and it now turns this into a laser prefab. Now, in order to fire this object, I'm going to attach some script to my player object. But before I do that, I want a location. I want a location where these laser blasts are going to come from. So, for example, if I wanted it to come from his eye, I might throw an object right there on his eye. So what I do is I usually create an empty game object, and I call it, say, for example, muzzle. For the end of the gun, or maybe gun. So this is going to represent the location of my gun, and I can drag that around now as a child of that parent object. So if this robot were to move, translate, or rotate, this gun location would also translate and move with him, which is nice because the physics engine of handling the robot would also handle moving the end of his gun or laser blaster to the right location. So if we put it here, the laser shots are going to come out of the end of this blue disc. If we put it up here, the laser blast would come out of his eye location, for example. So I'm just going to put it just off there in space, off the end of the blue tip. So that's my object called gun. Now I'm going to come back to my player object, and I'm going to add a script that's going to handle the firing of our prefab, the instantiation and firing of the bullets or laser blasts. So I'm going to add a component, and I'm going to add a script, a new script, and I'll call it player control. And I'm going to edit that script. So here in MonoDevelop, we have a blank script, and in update, I am going to respond to somebody pushing the space bar to fire the object. So I'll just do an if input dot get key down, and the key I'm going to respond to will be the space bar. So that'll be keycode dot space, and when that thing is pressed, I want to do some work here, and the thing I want to do is I want to create and fire a laser blast. So in order to do that, I have to have access to the prefab that I want to create a copy of. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a public variable up here of type Rigidbody 2D, and I'm going to call that, how about laser blast. And I also am going to want the gun location, so I'm going to need a transform, and I'm going to call that gun. And I'm also going to need some value to how fast I want the bullet to be fired with. So I'll call that public int, and I'll call it, how about a laser force. Those are just creating some variables that I'm going to have access to from inside of Unity. When you make them public in your script, they will appear as objects in the Unity editor. So what do I want to do then? I want to, when the mouse is, or when the key is pressed down, the space key is pressed down, I want to create a copy of my laser blast. And that the method you do that with is you create an instance of an object. So I use the instantiate command. So I need a new Rigidbody 2D object, and I'm going to call it, how about blast, and that's going to equal, and I need to instantiate a Rigidbody 2D. So I have to tell the instantiation command that I am creating a Rigidbody 2D. And that tells Instantiate that whatever it just created is going to be treated as a Rigidbody 2D. So instantiate. And instantiate needs to know what it should instantiate. It's going to instantiate this object, laser blast. It has no idea that the laser blast is actually that prefab laser. We're going to do that inside of Unity. If I call it laser blast here, I could, for example, associate that with an elephant prefab, and the gun could fire out elephants. So it's not the name that's significant. It's the fact that this name is the same as this name, which in Unity will match up with whatever prefab we attach to it. And where do I want to, the next command in my instantiate is where I want it located. So I'm going to locate it at the gun location, gun.position. And the last thing is this weird quaternion thing. This is a rotation object, and I am just going to use identity, meaning I don't want it to rotate any. Okay, so now I have a copy of this, this laser blast, and it would just sit there if I created it now. So I'm going to make it move by adding some force to it. So I'll add force, and I'm going to add force in which direction? I'm going to do it in the direction the gun is pointing to the right of the gun. And that has a unit vector, so that has a scale of 1. So right now this would be adding it with a force of 1, which is tiny. So I'm going to multiply that by the laser force variable, and now I can adjust that from inside of Unity. So here's all I need in my script to make my robot fire. So I'm going to build that script and see if I can. I was successful, and so let's head back over to Unity. And you'll now notice that in the player control script, once it loads, there are the variables that I created: laser blast, gun, and laser force. And so gun is expecting a transform, so I'm going to drop that gun object in there. Laser blast is expecting a prefab, so I'm going to drop that laser blast in there. And laser force is a number. How hard do I want to push this thing? So let's push on it with a force of 300. Okay, let's see what happens when we run. First of all, I have that extra laser blast floating there. I can get rid of that. That was just used to build my prefab. Okay, so let's see what happens if I hit space. Nothing. Oh, there we go. So the only downside is my laser blasts actually have mass to them. So my robot is actually getting a little bit of recoil, which is actually kind of cool, but not intended in this example. So I can, let me set my game not to maximize on play. Let's see if I get rid of my laser blast. and with my player selected, so the inspector's running, I'll go ahead and run that again. And so now, since it's running and this laser force variable is available in my inspector instead of being a constant in my program, I can now test that out. Like, for example, if I fire it with 300 and go, well, maybe that's not fast enough, I can make this 500, and then I could fire, and you'll notice that it travels much faster. So maybe I like 500 better as my laser blaster. And the nice thing too is now if I grab my robot and move him somewhere, you'll notice that the gun is attached to that robot. So if I keep firing, it's exactly where my robot is located. So pretty cool. So that's an example of how you can create instances of objects by attaching a game object to another object and using that as the source of the location of where the instantiation occurs, and using a prefab, dragging it into the script to gain access to which prefab you want to fire from that object.